She had 4 drops of water left, enough for 1 person, maybe 2 days. Then she heard a child crying in the desert. A little girl, 5 years old, lay crumpled in the dirt, barely breathing. And behind her, a man was crawling on his hands and knees, sunburned and broken, whispering 2 words over and over. Save her. Eliza poured every last drop of water into that child's mouth. Every last drop. She didn't know their names. She didn't know why they were out here. She just knew what dying looked like, because she had buried her husband and her 2-year-old son with her own hands. But what she didn't know was that this man was hiding a secret that would burn her world to the ground, literally. Armed men were coming. Her cabin would be set on fire. She would be forced to shoot a man in a dark hallway to protect a child that wasn't even hers. And by the end of it all, she would have to choose, run like she always did, or stay and risk losing everything one more time. Lesson and meaning. This story reminds us of a truth we too easily forget. Surviving is not the same as living. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting. It's choosing to love again when you've already lost everything. The people who change our lives don't always arrive when things are easy. They arrive when we have nothing left to give, and we give it anyway. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment. Tell me, what would you have done with that last cup of water? The sun that July did not just shine. It punished. 7 weeks without rain. 7 weeks of watching the creek behind her cabin shrink to a trickle, then to mud, then to nothing but cracked earth and silence. The well had gone dry 2 weeks back. Even the birds had given up singing. Eliza stood in the doorway of her 1-room cabin, squinting at the place where the mountains should have been. Heat rose off the ground in shimmering waves, bending the horizon until sky and earth blurred into one white sheet of nothing. The pine ridges that used to run green all the way to the snow line now looked gray and brittle, like the bones of something long dead. She was 31 years old and felt like she had lived 100 summers. The cabin sat in a high valley, tucked between 2 ridges that once held promise. She and Thomas had built this life together 7 years ago, planted a garden, raised chickens, talked about filling the house with children. Then the fever came through like a scythe and took Thomas in 4 days. Little Jamie lasted 6 weeks longer. He died in her arms on a Tuesday night while she sang him the only lullaby she knew. She had stayed because leaving meant admitting it was all for nothing. That Thomas did not matter. That Jamie did not matter. That the garden and the chickens and the dreams were just dust waiting to blow away. Her hands were chapped and scarred from mending fence posts alone. Her dress was patched in 4 places. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a braid that had not seen proper washing in days, because water was too precious to waste on vanity. Every drop was measured. Every swallow was borrowed from tomorrow. Eliza wiped the sweat from her forehead and turned back inside. The cabin was small. 1 room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a table she had built herself after Thomas died, because his hands had made the first one, and she could not bear to eat off it anymore. The air inside was thick enough to chew. She moved to the water barrel in the corner and dipped her tin cup, filling it exactly halfway. She had carved notches into the barrel to measure what was left. 4 days of water, if she was careful. 3, if she was not. She drank slowly, feeling each swallow like a small betrayal of the woman she would be tomorrow. Then she heard it, faint, distant, a sound that did not belong to wind or wildlife, a child crying. Eliza froze with the cup halfway to her lips. She set it down on the table and stood perfectly still, her fingers white on the edge. The heat pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, but she held her breath and listened, filtering out the buzz of insects, the whisper of dying grass, the creak of warped timber. There it was again, thin as wood smoke, weak, desperate. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The last time she had heard a child crying was the night Jamie died. For 1 terrible second, she was back in that darkness, holding his small, hot body, feeling the life drain out of him like water from a cracked cup. She gripped the door frame and forced herself to breathe. This sound was real. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the tree line. She grabbed the rifle from beside the door and stepped into the sun. The ground crunched under her boots. Dust rose with every step, coating her skirt, her arms, the back of her neck. She moved toward the tree line, toward the sound, her heart hammering. Out here, sounds carried strange. Out here, you did not always find what you were looking for. She pushed through a stand of parched junipers and stopped dead. A little girl lay crumpled in the dirt. Eliza's breath caught like a fishhook in her throat. The child could not have been more than 5, her blonde hair matted with dust and sweat, her small body motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her dress, once fine cotton with lace at the collar, now clung to her like a filthy rag. Eliza dropped to her knees and turned the girl over gently. The child's skin was burning. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Then she heard something else. A low, rasping sound, movement in the dirt. Eliza's head snapped up. A man was crawling toward them. He was on his hands and knees, dragging himself across the hard pan like a wounded animal. His hat was gone, his shirt was soaked through with sweat and caked with dust. His face was scorched red, his lips split so deep they had stopped bleeding. There was nothing left in him to bleed. He did not ask for water. He did not ask for help for himself. He looked at the girl and gasped 2 words. Save her. His voice cracked and broke. His arms gave out and he collapsed face first into the dirt, barely catching himself before his forehead hit the ground. I do not matter, he whispered. Just save her. Eliza looked at the child, looked at the man. She did not know these people. Did not know where they came from or why they were out here in the middle of nowhere with no water, no horses, no help. But she knew what dying looked like. She had watched it up close. And both of them were dying. She had half a canteen left, enough for one person to survive 2 more days. She unscrewed the cap and poured it all for the girl. Every last drop. She tilted the child's head back, let the water run past those cracked lips, watched the small throat work as she swallowed. The man watched too, and something in his wild eyes settled. Not relief, something deeper. Surrender. Eliza slung the rifle over her shoulder, crouched down and scooped the girl up. Light as kindling, the child's head fell against her shoulder, her breath shallow and hot. My cabin is a 1/4 mile that way, Eliza said to the man. Her voice was flat and hard. Follow me or die here. She did not wait for an answer. She did not look back, because she knew that if she turned around she would see Thomas crawling through the dirt, reaching for her, and she would break apart right there in the open with a dying child in her arms. She heard the man grunt behind her, heard him struggle to his feet, heard him stumble and fall once, curse under his breath, and get up again. She kept walking. If he could not keep up, that was his choosing. But she heard his boots dragging through the dust behind her, step after ragged step, and she knew he would follow her until his body quit. By the time she reached the cabin, her arms were shaking, and her lungs burned like she had swallowed coals. She kicked the door open, laid the girl on her bed, and went to work. She soaked a rag in the last of the barrel water and pressed it to the child's forehead, her neck, her wrists. The girl's eyes fluttered. A small broken sound escaped her throat. You are all right, Eliza murmured. You are all right now. The door banged open behind her. The man staggered inside and collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor with his legs splayed out and his chest heaving like a bellows. His eyes were barely open. Eliza grabbed the tin cup and filled it from the barrel. She crossed the room and shoved it into his hands. Drink slow, she said. You drink too fast, you will bring it right back up. He nodded and drank, his hands trembling so bad that water spilled down his chin and darkened the front of his shirt. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to the girl. She kept the rag cool, kept wiping the child down, kept whispering things she was not sure the girl could hear. the same things she had whispered to Jamie in those last hours, the same useless promises that God had not kept the first time around. After a while, the man's breathing evened out. Eliza allowed herself to look at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had figured, mid-30s maybe, though the sun and exhaustion had carved 10 extra years into his face. Dark hair, dark eyes, a strong jaw shadowed with days of stubble. His clothes were good quality, or they had been before the desert tried to kill him. The stitching on his boots was fine work, the kind of boots a man with money would wear. There was a wedding ring on his left hand. "What is her name?" Eliza asked quietly. He looked up. His eyes found focus on her face for the first time. "May," he said. His voice came out like gravel dragged over tin. "Her name is May. And yours?" He hesitated. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough for Eliza to notice. "Caleb," he said. "Just Caleb. No surname. No explanation." Eliza did not ask for more. She had lived long enough on the frontier to know that a man who hides his last name usually has a reason, and the reason is rarely good. She nodded once and turned back to the girl. She would find out soon enough what kind of trouble had followed this man into her valley. For now, all that mattered was keeping the child alive. Everything else could wait for morning. Outside, the sun went down like a coal sinking into ash, and the heat finally loosened its grip just enough to let the three of them breathe. Caleb Hart had once bought an entire township with a single signature. But lying on the floor of this woman's cabin, drinking water from her hand, he had never felt so poor in his life. The cabin was small enough that he could see every corner of it from where he sat slumped against the wall. One room, a loft for sleeping. A stone fireplace black with years of soot. A table built from rough timber, the joints tight but the wood unfinished. One chair. One bed, where his daughter lay with her eyes closed and a wet rag across her forehead. No photographs on the walls. No curtains on the single window. No quilt on the bed except a threadbare wool blanket that had been washed so many times the pattern was gone. The cabin looked like a place where someone had decided to stop pretending that comfort mattered. Caleb knew something about that kind of deciding. He watched the woman work. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done hard things alone for a long time. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She changed the rag on May's forehead every few minutes, dripping water past the child's cracked lips one drop at a time, checking the pulse at her small wrist with fingers that were rough as saddle leather, but gentle as anything Caleb had ever seen. His name was Caleb Hart, and he was the richest man in Montana Territory. He owned Hart Ranch, 20,000 acres of grassland, timber, and river bottom spread across the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range. 3,000 head of cattle, 40 hands on payroll, a 2-story ranch house with glass windows, a barn bigger than most churches, and water rights to 12 miles of creek that never ran dry. He had told this woman his first name and nothing else. He had his reasons. 8 months ago, his wife's younger sister, Victoria Ashford, had filed a petition with the county court seeking custody of May. Victoria claimed Caleb was unfit, said a remote ranch was no place for a child, said May needed a woman's guidance, proper schooling, a civilized home. What Victoria actually wanted was control. She had married a man named Raymond Ashford, who owned the bank in Ridgewood and half the businesses in town, and together they had enough money and influence to make life very difficult for a widowed rancher who spent his days on horseback and his nights staring at the empty side of his bed. 2 weeks ago, Victoria had obtained a temporary custody order from a judge whose campaign debts Raymond Ashford happened to hold. The order required Caleb to surrender May to Victoria's care pending a full hearing. Caleb did not surrender May. He put his daughter on a horse, rode into the high country, and disappeared. He told himself he was taking May to visit Sarah's grave, and that was partly true. Sarah was buried on a ridge above the ranch, in a little clearing surrounded by aspens, and he had taken May there to lay wildflowers on the stone. But on the way back, instead of turning toward home, he had kept riding north, into the empty country, into the drought, He was running, and then the heat storm came through, and the horses bolted and took the packs with them, and he had been walking with his daughter for 2 days with no water and no help and no plan except to keep her alive until his body gave out. And then this woman appeared. She had given them her last water. Every drop. Caleb understood what that meant. She had chosen to save strangers and condemn herself. He had seen men in the cattle business weigh odds like that and choose the other way every single time. He wanted to tell her the truth. All of it. That he was wealthy enough to buy her cabin and the whole valley it sat in. That he could repay her 100-fold. That there were men looking for him, and they were not good men, and she was in danger just by having him under her roof. But if he told her he was rich, she would ask questions. Why was he out here without an escort? Why was he traveling with a 5-year-old girl and no supplies? Why he had no spare horse, no canteen, no plan? And the answers to those questions would reveal that he had violated a court order, that by law he had kidnapped his own daughter. So he sat against the wall and watched her save May's life and said nothing. Night fell hard. The cabin went dark except for a single tallow candle the woman lit and set on the table. Caleb tried to stay awake, but his body was spent. He drifted in and out, waking each time to the sound of the woman's voice, low and steady, talking to May the way you talk to a child in a fever dream, telling her she was safe, telling her she was going to be all right. Somewhere around midnight, Caleb woke fully. The candle had burned low. The woman sat on the edge of the bed with May's small hand pressed between both of hers. The child was still burning with fever. At 3 a.m, May seized. Her small body went rigid, her back arching off the mattress, her eyes rolling white. Caleb scrambled to his feet, but his legs buckled and he caught himself on the table. The woman was already moving. She rolled May onto her side with one smooth motion, cradled the child's head to keep it from striking the bed frame, and held her steady. She did not panic. She did not cry out. She counted the seconds under her breath, her face white and fixed, like a woman who had done this before and knew exactly how it could end. The seizure lasted 40 seconds. Then May went limp, her breathing ragged and shallow. The woman checked her pulse, checked her pupils, adjusted the wet rag. Then she sank to the floor beside the bed and sat there with her back against the wall, and her knees drawn up and her hands shaking in her lap. Caleb lowered himself to the floor beside her. Not close enough to touch, just close enough to be present. "Thank you," he said. She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on some point across the room that Caleb could not see. "Do not thank me," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something cracked and sharp like broken glass. "Just keep that child alive." He understood then that her anger was not aimed at him. It was aimed at God or fate, or whatever power had decided that some children lived and some did not. She had fought this battle before, and she had lost. May's fever broke before dawn. The child's breathing steadied, her skin cooled, and she slipped from the dangerous place into ordinary sleep. The woman, who had not told Caleb her name until he asked for it, watched over the girl until the first gray light crept through the window. Her name was Eliza Crow. Caleb did not sleep again that night. He sat in the chair by the cold fireplace and watched the shadows move across the ceiling and thought about all the things he should say and all the reasons he could not say them. In the morning, when Eliza went to the creek bed to see if any water had collected overnight, Caleb stepped outside. The cabin sat on a small rise, and behind it, shaded by a single pine tree that was still clinging to life, he found 2 graves. They were marked with simple wooden crosses, the kind a person carves by hand with a pocket knife, taking care with each letter, because there is no one else to do it. The first cross read, "Thomas Crow, beloved husband." The second cross was smaller. It read, "Jamie Crow, age 2, sleeping with Papa." Caleb stood in front of those graves for a long time. The morning sun climbed over the ridge and threw long shadows across the dry grass, and he read those words again and again until they burned into him. She had lost her husband. She had lost her child. She had stayed out here alone for 3 years, tending these graves, rationing water, mending fences, talking to the dead because there was no one alive to talk to. And when a stranger crawled out of the desert with a dying girl, she had given them everything she had left. Caleb wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He went inside. Eliza was spooning broth into May's mouth, drop by careful drop. The child was awake, weak, but awake. Her blue eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the unfamiliar walls, the strange woman's face, the low ceiling of a cabin that was not her home. "Papa," May whispered. Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. He took his daughter's hand and held it in both of his, and for a moment he could not speak because his throat was closed up tight. "I am right here, sweetheart," he managed. "I am right here." May's eyes drifted to Eliza. She studied the woman's face with the serious, unblinking attention of a child who is trying to decide whether the world is safe. "Are you an angel?" May asked. "No," Eliza said. "Just a neighbor." She turned away to tend the stove, and Caleb saw her shoulders shake, just for a heartbeat, before she steadied herself and went back to work. He did not look at Eliza the way a man looks at a stranger anymore. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has carried the same weight he carries, someone who knows exactly what it costs to keep standing when the ground falls out from under you. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold water, that he was going to have to tell her the truth. All of it. Before the men who were hunting him found this cabin. He just was not ready yet. Eliza had gone 3 years without seeing another living soul. Now, inside of 5 days, she had 2 strangers in her cabin and 3 men on horseback outside her door. The frontier had its own way of reminding her that loneliness was a luxury. May was getting stronger. Not well, but better. On the 4th morning, she sat up in bed and asked for bread. Eliza gave her the last of the hardtack, softened in water, and watched her eat it slowly. The girl chewed each bite like it was something precious. May had started following Eliza around the cabin. Not talking much, just watching. She watched how Eliza measured water from the barrel, how she stirred the pot of dried beans on the stove, how she patched a hole in her apron with a needle and thread, her stitches small and even. "Why do you keep following me?" Eliza asked on the 5th morning. She did not say it unkindly. She was just not used to being watched. May looked up at her with those dark eyes, so much like her father's, and said something that stopped Eliza's hands mid-stitch. "Because you are like Mama, not your face, the way you hold things, like you are afraid they will break." Eliza set the needle down and breathed through the ache in her chest. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was level. "I will take that as a compliment." May almost smiled. Caleb had recovered enough to move around without leaning on the walls. He fixed the loose hinge on the cabin door, patched a crack in the chimney stone where smoke had been leaking. He worked quietly with the careful precision of a man who was used to building things, and he did not talk while he worked. Eliza appreciated that. Silence between people who are working is a different kind of silence than the silence between people who have nothing to say. But she watched him too, the same way May watched her. She noticed things. The way his hands moved, sure and capable, but not the hands of a common laborer, too clean under the nails once the desert dirt was scrubbed off. The way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin level, like a man accustomed to being in charge. The way his eyes went distant sometimes, fixed on a point beyond the cabin walls, and she could tell he was calculating something. Planning. He had told her his name was Caleb. He had told her he was wealthy, that his wife's sister was suing for custody of May. He had told her there was trouble behind him and safety ahead if they could reach his ranch. He had told her all of that on the evening after the riders came. They appeared on the 5th day around noon when the heat was at its worst, and the air was so still you could hear a horse's breathing from 200 yards. Eliza saw them first. 3 riders coming across the valley floor, moving slow and deliberate, following the creek bed that led straight to her cabin. They were not in a hurry. Men who ride that slow either know where they are going or do not care who sees them coming. "Caleb!" she called through the window. He came outside. May was at his side, her small hand gripping 2 of his fingers. He followed Eliza's gaze to the riders and went very still. "You know them?" Eliza asked. "No," he said, but the way he said it made her hand move to the rifle. The riders came closer and reined up about 50 yards from the cabin, sitting their horses in a loose line. 3 men. The 2 on the flanks were ranch hand types, sun-darkened and hard-looking, each wearing a sidearm and carrying a rifle in a saddle scabbard. Nothing unusual in that. Half the men in Montana Territory went armed as a matter of course. But the man in the center was different. He was older than the other 2, maybe 45, with the kind of build that suggested he had been powerful once and was still plenty dangerous. Thick through the shoulders and chest, narrow in the hips, sitting his saddle like he had been born in it. His face was hard and seamed, the color of old leather, and a long scar ran diagonally from his left eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose. It pulled at the skin around his eye, giving him a permanent half-squint that made it look like he was always sizing up a target. Pinned to his vest, catching the sun, was a marshal's badge. "Caleb Hart," the man called out. His voice was flat and even, pitched to carry without shouting, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting on May's shoulder. "That is me." The man nudged his horse a few steps closer. "Name is Silas Wilder. I have been hired to bring you and the girl back to the valley. There are people worried about you." Eliza studied Wilder's face while Caleb talked. The badge looked real enough, but the man wearing it did not look like any lawman she had ever seen. He looked like a hunter. The kind of man who tracked things for a living and did not much care whether he brought them back breathing or not. "I appreciate the concern," Caleb said evenly, "but we are fine." "Did not look fine when your horses came back without you," Wilder said. His eyes moved from Caleb to Eliza, taking her in with the quick, thorough assessment of a man who catalogues threats for a living. She felt the weight of that look and did not flinch from it. "We had some trouble," Caleb said. "It is handled." Wilder's gaze settled on May. The girl pressed closer to her father's leg. "Mrs. Ashford is mighty concerned about the child," Wilder said. "She asked me personally to see the girl home safe." "May is home," Caleb said. Something cold crept into Wilder's expression. The 2 men on his flanks shifted in their saddles. "Well," Wilder said, "we will take you back now, you and the girl. Get you home safe. We will leave when we are ready," Caleb said. Wilder dismounted. He did it smooth and easy, swinging down from the saddle with the practiced grace of a man who has climbed on and off 1,000 horses. He walked toward them, not fast, deliberate, each boot step raising a small puff of dust. Eliza raised the rifle. Wilder did not stop. He walked straight toward her, slow as a sunset, and he did not take his eyes off hers. He stopped when the muzzle of the rifle pressed against the center of his chest. She could feel the heat coming off him, could smell horse sweat and leather and something metallic underneath. "You shoot me," he said quietly. "You kill a territorial marshal. They will hang you, and the girl still goes with us." Eliza's finger rested beside the trigger. "Not on it. Beside it." She had been taught the difference by Thomas, who had been taught by his father, who had fought in the Mexican War. "You are no marshal," Eliza said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her because her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Marshals do not hunt children." Something shifted in Wilder's expression. Not anger. Something closer to interest. He looked at her like a man who had just found an unexpected piece on the board. Then Caleb stepped out of the cabin. Eliza had seen him weak. She had seen him crawling. She had seen him helpless on her cabin floor, trembling and spent. But the man who stepped onto that porch was someone else entirely. His back was straight. His jaw was set. His dark eyes had gone cold and flat, like the surface of a frozen lake, and when he spoke, his voice had changed so completely that Eliza almost turned to see if a different person had walked out the door. "Wilder," Caleb said, "you ride back and tell Raymond Ashford that if he sends men again, I will not talk. I will send them back in pine boxes, and you know damn well I can." Wilder's gaze moved from Eliza to Caleb. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then the scar across Wilder's eye twitched, and he grinned. It was not a frightened grin. It was the grin of a man who had just recalculated the odds and found them more interesting than expected. "3 days, Mr. Hart," Wilder said. He stepped back, easy and unhurried, and swung up onto his horse. "After that, I stop asking." The 3 riders turned and headed back the way they had come. Eliza watched them until the dust settled and the valley was empty again. Then she turned to Caleb and said the words she had been holding behind her teeth since the first night. "Who are you? And I mean all of it this time." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the porch step and told her. He told her about the ranch, 20,000 acres, 3,000 head of cattle, the biggest operation in the territory. He told her about Sarah, his wife, who had died in childbirth 2 years ago, about Victoria, Sarah's sister, who had filed for custody, about the hearing, the lawyers, the money arrayed against him. He told her he had taken May to visit Sarah's grave and gotten caught in a heat storm that spooked the horses and left them stranded. And Eliza listened. She listened the way she did everything, carefully, measuring each word the way she measured water. And when he finished, she looked at him for a long time. "You are telling me the truth," she said slowly, "but not the whole truth. I can see it. You skip over parts like a man hopping stones across a creek." Caleb met her eyes. He did not deny it. "I will help you get May somewhere safe," Eliza said. "But if I find out you lied to me, I will stop walking in the middle of nowhere, and you can sort it yourself." Caleb nodded. "Fair enough." They left before dawn the next morning. Eliza packed what little she could carry, the canteen, some dried meat, the rifle with 5 rounds remaining, a change of clothes rolled tight in a flour sack. She locked the cabin door and stood for a moment on the porch, looking back at the 2 graves under the dying pine. "Thomas," she whispered, "you hold on to Jamie for me. I've got to go keep this one alive." She turned the key and did not look back. Caleb carried May on his back, the girl's thin arms wrapped around his neck, her cheek pressed against his shoulder. She had not spoken since they woke her, just nodded when her father explained they were leaving. Her eyes were dark and solemn in the gray light before sunrise. They walked south, following the dry creek bed. The land stretched out before them in shades of dust and shadow, and the mountains behind them turned purple as the sun began to climb. They had been walking 2 hours when Eliza saw the smoke. It rose from behind them, thick and black against the pale sky, climbing in a column that leaned east with the wind. It came from the direction of her cabin. Caleb saw it too. His step faltered. His jaw tightened. "Do not look back," he said quietly. Eliza did not look back, but she knew. Someone had burned the only home she had left on this earth, the cabin Thomas had built, the walls where Jamie had taken his first steps, the graves she had tended every morning for 3 years. Gone. She kept walking. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She had used up her tears a long time ago. All that was left was the hard white heat of fury, and she fed it into her legs and kept moving, one step after another, south through the dust. Caleb did not speak. He knew better. May lifted her head from her father's shoulder and looked back at the smoke. "Miss Eliza," she said softly, "is that your house?" Eliza's throat closed. She swallowed hard and kept her eyes forward. "It was," she said, "not anymore." May was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out one small hand and rested it on Eliza's shoulder. The gesture was so light, Eliza almost did not feel it. But she did. And something inside her, something that had been locked shut for 3 years, cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of pain so sharp it felt like light. She reached up and covered May's hand with her own. Just for a second. Then she let go and kept walking. Behind them, the smoke climbed higher, and the cabin where Eliza Crow had survived her grief burned down to ash and memory. Ahead of them, somewhere in the dust, Silas Wilder was counting down. 3 days, 45 miles, 1 rifle with 5 rounds, a child who could not walk faster than 2 miles an hour, and somewhere behind them, in the dust, 3 campfires burned where there should have been none. Caleb carried May until his shoulders screamed and his legs went numb. Then he set her down and she walked beside him, her small hand gripping 2 of his fingers. When she could not walk anymore, he carried her again. They moved south through the dry creek bed, following the path of water that no longer existed, and the sun climbed overhead and turned the world into a furnace. Eliza walked point. She kept the rifle loose in her hands and her eyes moving, scanning the scrub brush and the rocky outcrops and the long, empty stretches where a man on horseback could be seen from a mile away. She did not speak. Conserving water meant conserving breath, and every word cost moisture they could not spare. But the silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with things unsaid. Caleb could feel it pressing against his ribs every time he looked at her back, at the straight set of her shoulders, at the braid that swung between her shoulder blades with each step. She had not spoken to him beyond necessity since the smoke rose behind them. She was angry. He understood that. Her cabin was gone. Her graves were gone. Everything she had left in the world had burned because of him, and he had not even had the courage to tell her the whole truth about why. By mid-morning, they reached the halfway point. A way station sat at a crossroads where 2 wagon trails met. It was a low-slung building with a plank porch, a corral made of split rail fence, and a well with a hand pump that looked like it might still work. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Eliza stopped and turned to Caleb. Her face was flushed with heat, and her eyes were hard. "May needs water," she said. "If someone in there recognizes me," Caleb said, "Wilder will know which direction we are headed." "May needs water," Eliza repeated. "Not tomorrow. Now." Caleb looked at his daughter. May's lips were cracked again. Her skin was flushed and dry. She leaned against his leg with the boneless exhaustion of a child who has nothing left to give. "I am protecting my daughter," he said. "No," Eliza said, and her voice had an edge like a skinning knife. "You are protecting your secret. There is a difference." She turned and walked toward the way station, alone. Caleb stood in the scrub brush with May and watched her go. He wanted to call after her, to argue, to explain. But she was right, and he knew it, and knowing it felt worse than the heat. The door of the way station opened before Eliza reached it, and a woman stepped out. She was 60 or so, gray-haired, weathered to rawhide, with eyes like chips of flint and a snub-nosed pistol tucked into the waistband of her apron. She looked Eliza up and down without a word. "I need water," Eliza said. "I cannot pay." The woman studied her for a long moment. Behind those flint eyes, calculations were being made. Then she stepped aside and held the door open. "Come on in," she said. "You look about half dead." Her name was Ida Finch. She had been running this way station for 11 years, ever since her husband got himself killed in a card game in Virginia City, and left her with nothing but the building, the well, and a talent for surviving things that should have finished her off. She set a bucket of water on the bar and watched Eliza drink. "You running from something or running to something?" Ida asked. Eliza wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Have not decided yet." Ida's lips twitched. That was as close to a smile as she seemed to get. She filled 2 canteens from the well and wrapped cornmeal and dried beans in brown paper. "Got a man and a child out there, do you?" Ida said. It was not a question. Eliza nodded. Ida leaned against the bar and crossed her arms. "Riders came through here this morning," she said. Her voice dropped lower. "Asking after a man traveling with a little girl. I told them I had not seen a soul, but you ought to know. The one doing the asking had a scar across his left eye, and he asked real polite. She paused. The kind of man who asks polite right before he shoots. Eliza's stomach tightened. How many? 3 this morning. But there was another group came through yesterday. 5 men heading north. If they have joined up, that makes 8. Eliza took the canteens and the food and looked at Ida Finch. Why are you helping me? She asked. Ida shrugged. I do not care for men who hunt children, and I especially do not care for men who ride under a badge they bought instead of earned. At the door, Eliza paused. Thank you. Ida waved her off. Get gone before someone else rides through. And tell that man of yours, whoever he is, that if he has any sense at all, he will stay off the main trail. There is an old logging road east of here that runs through the timber. Harder going, but harder to follow. She went back to the bar and picked up a rag and started wiping the counter like Eliza had never been there at all. They filled the canteens and ate the cornmeal mixed with water, which was not good but was better than nothing. May drank carefully the way Eliza had taught her, small sips with pauses between. Then they moved east, leaving the wagon trail for the rougher country Ida had described. The land climbed. Scrub pine gave way to taller timber, and the air cooled just enough to make the walking bearable. But the trail was barely visible, an old track through the undergrowth where loggers had dragged timber years ago, and it switchbacked up the hillside in a way that doubled the distance for every mile of progress. They walked until the sun was directly overhead, and the heat became a weight pressing down on their shoulders. Caleb found a shallow overhang of rock that offered a hand's width of shade, and they stopped. May slid off Caleb's back and sat down in the dirt. She did not complain. She had not complained once in 2 days, and that worried Eliza more than crying would have. Children who stop complaining are children who are learning to expect nothing. Eliza passed the canteen, small sips. May drank and handed it back. Caleb drank and offered it to Eliza. She took just enough to wet her throat. They sat in the shade with their backs against the rock. May leaned against her father's side. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. Then Caleb said quietly, "You lost your home because of me." Eliza did not look at him. She was staring out at the empty land, at the heat waves rising off the rocks, at the enormous indifferent sky. "I lost my home because of Wilder," she said. "Do not take credit for another man's cruelty." Caleb almost smiled. Eliza caught it from the corner of her eye, that slight lift at the corner of his mouth, and something twisted beneath her ribs. A feeling she had not felt in 3 years and did not want to feel now. She looked away. That night they sheltered in the overhang. May slept between them, curled on her side with her head on Caleb's folded jacket and her feet touching Eliza's leg. The stars came out thick and cold, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled and was answered by another. Caleb spoke first. His voice was low, pitched not to wake May. "Sarah loved the stars," he said. "My wife. She used to lie on the porch and name the constellations. She knew all of them. I never learned more than the Big Dipper, and she used to laugh at me for it." Eliza listened. She did not ask questions. She understood that this was an offering, not a conversation. "She was a good woman," Caleb continued. "Kind. Gentle. She saw the best in everyone, even people who did not deserve it, even her sister." "How did she die?" Eliza asked quietly. "The baby was breech. The midwife could not turn him. Sarah bled for hours." Caleb's voice was flat. The way voices go when the person speaking has told the story so many times it is worn smooth like a river stone. "The baby died first. Then Sarah." Eliza was quiet for a long time. "Thomas died on a Tuesday," she said finally. She had not said his name out loud to another person in 3 years. "Typhoid. He was fine in the morning and burning by noon and dead by Thursday. Jamie caught it too. He held on longer than his father. He was a stubborn little thing. She paused. He died in my arms while I was singing to him. Neither of them spoke the names of the children they had lost. Those names sat between them like stones too heavy to lift, and they both understood without saying it that this was the boundary line, the deepest grief. The place neither of them was ready to let another person enter. Caleb looked at her across the sleeping child. In the starlight, his face was all shadow and sharp edges, and Eliza could not read his expression, but she felt his gaze like the heat from a banked fire. "I am sorry," he said. She nodded. She did not say it back. Not because she was not sorry, but because the word felt too small for what they carried. They kept watch in shifts. Eliza took the first, sitting with the rifle across her knees, listening to the night. The sounds of the wilderness were familiar. Insects, wind in the pine boughs, the far-off cry of an owl. She let them wash over her and tried not to think about the cabin, the graves, the life that was now a column of smoke dissipating into a sky that did not care. She woke Caleb at midnight and lay down in the spot where May had shifted, curling her body around the child without thinking about it. May murmured in her sleep and pressed closer, and Eliza felt the small warmth of her against her chest and closed her eyes against the ache. She slept, and for the first time in months, she did not dream about Jamie. The next morning they rose before dawn and kept moving. Mid-morning, the trail narrowed to a thread running along a dry wash. May was walking on her own, holding Caleb's hand, when she suddenly stopped and pointed. "Snake," she said. A diamondback rattler lay coiled in the path, thick as Eliza's forearm, its tail buzzing in the still air. May was 3 feet from it. Caleb was too far back. Eliza raised the rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot cracked across the hillside and echoed off the rocks. The snake's head disappeared in a spray of dust and scales. May screamed and stumbled backward into her father's arms. Eliza's first bullet. Clean. 1 shot. Her hands were shaking. Adrenaline flooded through her and left her dizzy, and she knelt in the dirt and breathed hard through her nose until the world stopped tilting. May was crying against Caleb's chest. He held her with one arm and looked at Eliza over the child's head. Something in his expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly. Deeper than that. Recognition. Like a man who has just discovered that the person standing next to him in a storm is the one person he can trust. "Thank you," he said. Eliza straightened up and wiped the sweat from her face. "4 rounds left," she said. "I would appreciate if the wildlife cooperated from here on out." They kept walking. That evening they made camp in a dry wash where a few scraggly cottonwoods offered cover. They ate the last of the cornmeal. May fell asleep early, exhausted from the day's walk. Caleb and Eliza sat across from each other in the fading light. "Tell me about your ranch," Eliza said. Caleb looked surprised. She had not asked him anything personal since the confrontation outside the cabin. "It is big," he said. 2-story house, timber construction, barn that holds 40 horses, bunkhouse, cattle pens, smithy. We run 3,000 head across 20 sections. 20 sections, Eliza repeated. That was 12,000 acres. More land than she could picture. "My father started it," Caleb said. "Built it from nothing. It came to me when he died. I have been running it for 10 years. And you have men working for you, hands, foremen. About 40. Good men, most of them. Been with the ranch for years." Eliza chewed slowly on a strip of dried meat and said nothing for a while. "How far?" she asked. "From here. Maybe 20 miles. Day and a half if we push." She nodded and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere in that darkness, campfires burned. "We had better push," she said. That second night, Eliza woke to a sound that did not belong. She grabbed the rifle and crawled to the edge of the wash, pressing her body flat against the dirt. Half a mile south, 3 campfires flickered in the darkness. Not 1 fire. 3. Wilder was not traveling alone anymore. Eliza crawled back to where Caleb slept and shook him awake. She held a finger to her lips and pointed. His face went tight in the moonlight. They woke May, shouldered their things, and moved out in the dark, keeping to the timber, stepping careful on the pine needles to muffle their footsteps. Behind them, the fires glowed like orange eyes watching from the blackness. Caleb knew two things for certain. His daughter would not be taken, and the woman running beside him would not be harmed. He just was not sure he could keep both promises at once. They moved fast through the timber, faster than was safe in the dark. Pine branches whipped against Caleb's face and arms. May clung to his back with her face buried against his neck, silent and trembling. Eliza moved ahead, picking a path through the undergrowth with the sure-footed instinct of a woman who had spent years walking rough country alone. Dawn found them high on a ridge, looking down into a narrow canyon choked with lodgepole pine. Behind and below, the flat country they had crossed spread out in shades of brown and gold, and somewhere in that distance, dust moved. "Riders," Eliza said. Caleb saw them. A group of horsemen moving along the wagon trail, still a few miles back, but closing. He counted. 6 riders, maybe 7. Wilder had picked up reinforcements. "They are following our trail," Caleb said. Eliza studied the terrain. "We need to move faster. If they find where we left the main trail, they will cut through the timber and come at us from below." "I know a way," Caleb said. "There's an old logging road that drops over the far side of this ridge. It comes out at the north end of my property. If we can make the ranch, we have men and guns." "How far?" 8 miles. 8. "Rough going, but downhill most of the way. Then stop talking and start walking." They pushed hard through the morning. The trail was barely a trail, more like a scar in the timber where someone had dragged logs through 20 years ago. It was steep, rocky, and treacherous, with loose shale that shifted underfoot. May could not walk it. Caleb carried her the entire way, his legs burning, his broken arm aching where he had landed on it wrong the night before. They were 2 miles from the ranch when the timber thinned and the trail forked. Caleb chose the left fork from memory. The right one led to a dead end at an old mine shaft. They came around a bend and found 2 men on horseback blocking the trail. Caleb stopped. Eliza stepped beside him, rifle up. The riders were young, hard-faced, wearing the dust of a long ride. One of them had a bandana pulled up over his nose. The other held a rifle aimed loosely at Caleb's chest. "Mr. Hart," the one with the rifle said. "Mr. Wilder sends his regards. Says he gave you 3 days and you used them up." Eliza did not wait for Caleb to answer. She raised her rifle and fired. The shot hit the man's shoulder. He jerked backward in the saddle, dropped his weapon, and grabbed at the wound with his free hand. His horse reared and screamed. The second rider swore and yanked his mount around, fumbling for his pistol. Eliza worked the lever and chambered another round. But the second man had already wheeled his horse and was crashing back through the brush, branches snapping around him as he fled. The wounded man slumped in his saddle. His horse danced sideways, confused and panicked, and then it bolted after its companion, carrying the man with it. Eliza lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking. Her face was white. She had never shot a person before. She walked 3 steps off the trail, leaned against a pine tree, and was violently sick. Caleb set May down gently and moved toward Eliza, but she held up a hand without looking at him. "Give me a minute," she said. He stopped. He stood between her and the trail, between her and whatever might come next. And he waited. May sat on a rock with her arms around her knees and watched her father watch Eliza, and she did not make a sound. After a minute, Eliza straightened up. She wiped her mouth on her sleeve. She picked up the rifle, checked the action, and looked at Caleb. 3 rounds left, she said. Let us keep moving. They reached the ridgeline at noon. Caleb heard Eliza's breath catch. Below them, the valley spread out wide and green, cut through its center by a river that caught the sunlight and threw it back in silver ribbons. And there, nestled against the base of the mountains, lay Hart Ranch. It was bigger than anything Eliza had imagined. The main house was exactly as Caleb had described, 2 stories of solid timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, glass windows that flashed in the sun. A barn the size of a church, Corrals, cattle pens, a bunkhouse, a smithy, all of it spread across the valley floor in a sprawl of ordered industry. Cattle dotted the pastures. Riders moved between the buildings. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney where someone was cooking the midday meal. It looked like a kingdom. Eliza stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at Caleb, at his dust-covered clothes, his sunburned face, the daughter clinging to his back. "You live there," she said. "I do," Caleb said. Something shifted in Eliza's expression. Not awe. Something colder. Caleb felt it like a door closing. They descended the far side of the ridge and crossed the last stretch of open ground. Caleb put his fingers to his lips and blew a sharp whistle. 2 short blasts and 1 long. An old signal. 5 seconds later, an answering whistle came from the barn. A man came running out of the barn door. 60 years old, thick through the chest with a gray beard and legs bowed from a lifetime in the saddle. He wore a Union Army belt buckle and carried a lantern even though the sun was high. Dutch Miller had been Caleb's foreman for 12 years and had been his father's before that. He was loyal, the way granite is hard. It was not a choice. It was composition. "Lord Almighty, boss," Dutch said. He stopped dead when he saw Caleb, and his eyes went wide, and for a moment the tough old man looked like he might cry. "We figured you for dead." "Not yet," Caleb said. Dutch's gaze moved to May. "Little miss, you all right?" May nodded tiredly. "Hi, Dutch." Then Dutch looked at Eliza. He took in the rifle, the patched dress, the dust and sunburn and the set of her jaw, and he made whatever calculation an old soldier makes when he sees a new variable on the field. "Who is this?" he asked. Before Caleb could answer, the front door of the house flew open and a woman came down the steps fast enough to make the porch boards rattle. She was round-faced, gray-haired, wearing an apron streaked with flour. Her name was Martha Kincaid. She had been running the Hart household since before Caleb's father died, and she had the disposition of a mother bear disturbed from winter sleep. She swept May into her arms and held the girl so tight it was a wonder the child could breathe. Tears ran down Martha's face, unchecked. "Lord above," she gasped. "Lord above, you are alive." She looked at Caleb with eyes that burned. "Do not you ever do that to us again, Caleb Hart. You hear me?" "Yes, ma am," Caleb said, and he meant it. Then Martha turned to Eliza. She took in the same things Dutch had taken in, and she reached her own conclusions faster. "And who is this?" Martha asked. "Eliza Crow," Caleb said. "She saved our lives. If it were not for her, we would not be standing here." Martha crossed the yard and took Eliza's hand in both of hers. Her grip was strong and warm. "Then you are welcome here as long as you need," Martha said. "Come on, inside, food, water, rest. Everything else can wait." Eliza let herself be pulled toward the house. Her legs were shaking now that the walking was done. She climbed the porch steps and paused at the door. The house was everything her cabin was not. Spacious, furnished, clean. A real kitchen with a cast-iron stove. A dining table that could seat 12. Rugs on the wooden floors. Glass in the windows. She stood in the doorway of this house that was 50 times the size of the home she had lost. And she understood something clearly and completely. Caleb Hart's world and her world were separated by a distance that had nothing to do with miles. She was a penniless widow in a patched dress who owned nothing but a rifle and the clothes on her back. He was the richest man in the territory. Whatever partnership they had forged in the desert was a thing of necessity. Now that the necessity was gone, so was the partnership. Here, in this fine house with its glass windows and hired hands, Eliza Crow was an outsider. She stepped inside anyway, because Martha was pulling her by the hand, and May was already at the table eating bread, and Eliza's body had reached the end of what it could do. Later, after Martha had fed them and shown May to a warm bed upstairs, Eliza found Caleb in the yard talking with Dutch and 2 other hands. Their voices were low and urgent. She caught fragments. Victoria, court order, custody, 5 days. Caleb saw her and straightened up. Dutch fell silent. May is safe now, Eliza said. I should go. Caleb looked at her. Go where? Your cabin burned. Eliza's jaw tightened. It burned because of you. Do not use that to keep me here. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. She watched something pass behind his eyes. Guilt, calculation, something else she could not name. You are right, he said. I owe you. I will give you money, a horse, whatever you need. But at least stay until you have rested. You are running on fumes same as I am. Eliza wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away from this ranch and this man and the trouble that followed him like a shadow. But her legs ached. Her boots had rubbed blisters on both heels. She had nowhere to go and nothing to go with. And the honest truth was, she was too tired to be proud. One night, she said. That night, while Eliza bathed in the first hot water she had touched in weeks, and slept in a real bed with clean sheets and a pillow that smelled of lavender, she heard Dutch's voice carry through an open window. The old foreman was in the yard below, talking to Caleb. Boss, you understand that if the court finds out you took May while that custody order was in force, you are not just losing May. You are looking at time in the territorial prison. Caleb's reply was too low for Eliza to hear, but she heard the tone, heavy, broken. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood that the man she had trusted had been lying to her from the very first word. Eliza knew what betrayal felt like. It did not cut like a knife, it felt like discovering a crack in the foundation. Everything above still looked fine, but underneath, the whole structure was giving way. She dressed and went downstairs before dawn. Martha was already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough by lantern light, and the smell of coffee filled the house. Eliza poured herself a cup and sat at the table and waited. Caleb came downstairs an hour later. He looked like he had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face had the hollow, caved-in look of a man who has spent the night wrestling with something bigger than himself. He saw Eliza sitting at the table and stopped in the kitchen doorway. We need to talk, she said. Caleb glanced at Martha, who was wiping flour from her hands and studying both of them with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had survived a war and 2 husbands and had very little patience for foolishness. Martha, Caleb said. I will be upstairs with the child, Martha said, and left without another word. Eliza waited until she heard Martha's footsteps on the upper floor. Then she set her coffee cup down and looked at Caleb across the table. You violated a court order, she said. Her voice was flat and level, the way she had learned to speak when the thing she was feeling was too big for the words available. You did not take May to visit a grave. You took her to hide. Caleb sat down across from her. He did not deny it. I took my daughter because if I had not, Victoria would have come for her the next morning, he said. That custody order was signed by a judge that Raymond Ashford bought. It was not lawful. Maybe, Eliza said, but you did not tell me. You let me shoot a man, lose my home, walk 45 miles through the desert, all on half the truth. Caleb's hands were flat on the table. If I had told you everything, would you have come? The question hung between them. Eliza knew the answer. If he had told her on that first day that he was a fugitive from the court, that he had taken his daughter in defiance of a custody order, that armed men were hunting him and anyone near him was in danger, she would have given him water, pointed him south, and closed her door. No, she said quietly, I would not have come. And that is why I did not tell you, Caleb said, because I was desperate, and because you were the only chance my daughter had. So you used me. I did not use you. I needed you. There is a difference. From where I am sitting, it looks about the same. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscles in his neck standing out like rope. Well, what do you want me to say, Eliza? That I am sorry? I am. That I should have told you the truth? I should have, but if I had, May might be dead right now, and I will not apologize for keeping my daughter alive. Eliza stared at him for a long time. Then she stood up and took her coffee cup to the counter. I am staying until I figure out where I'm going, she said. But I am not your friend. I am not your ally. I am a woman with no home and no horse and nothing to my name, except a rifle with 3 rounds. You owe me for what I lost, and I aim to collect. Beyond that, we have nothing to say to each other. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs and shut the bedroom door behind her. She did not come down for the rest of the morning. May noticed. Children always notice, even when adults think they are hiding it. Around noon, May found Eliza sitting by the upstairs window, staring out at the valley. "Is Miss Eliza mad at Papa?" May asked. She stood in the doorway in a clean dress Martha had found for her, her blonde hair brushed and braided, looking like a different child than the one Eliza had found dying in the dust. "Grown-up business," Eliza said. "Nothing for you to worry about." May came and sat on the bed beside her. She was quiet for a moment, the way she always was before she said something that cut too close to the bone. "Mama used to say that too," May said, "right before she and Papa had their last fight. Then Mama went away and never came back." The words hit Eliza like a fist. She looked at this small girl who had already lost her mother and almost lost her life, and was now watching the one woman who had saved her pull away. And she felt something crack inside her chest. "Your mama did not leave because she wanted to," Eliza said carefully. "And I am not leaving, promise?" Eliza hesitated. She did not make promises she might not keep. But May's eyes were so wide and so serious and so frightened that Eliza heard herself say the word before she could stop it. Promise. That afternoon, a single rider appeared on the ranch road. Eliza was on the porch when she saw the horse coming in from the east. She reached for the rifle out of habit, but Dutch, who was leaning against the porch rail whittling a stick, shook his head. "It is a woman," he said. He was right. As the rider drew closer, Eliza could see that it was a woman sitting side-saddle on a tall gray horse. She wore black from head to heel, a riding habit of expensive cloth, and her dark hair was pinned beneath a hat that probably cost more than everything Eliza had ever owned. She rode up to the house and dismounted with the practiced grace of someone who had been taught to ride by an instructor rather than by necessity. Victoria Ashford had come alone. She was younger than Eliza had expected. Late 20s, with a sharp, angular face and dark eyes that held a grief so old it had hardened into something else. She was thin in a way that suggested she did not eat enough, and her hands were restless, moving from her collar to her sleeve to the horse's reins and back again. Dutch straightened up. His hand went to the pistol on his hip. "Easy," Eliza said. Victoria stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked at Eliza. Not at the rifle, not at the dress, not at the obvious poverty. She looked at Eliza the way one woman looks at another when she is trying to decide if she is dealing with a fool or an equal. "Who are you?" Victoria asked. Her voice was cultured and controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it that she could not quite hide. "The woman who kept May alive when she was dying in the dirt," Eliza said. Victoria's chin lifted. "You think I want May dead? You think I am some kind of monster? I think you want to win more than you want what is best for that child." Something broke in Victoria's expression, just for a moment. Then she rebuilt it, the way people do when they have been practicing control for so long it has become armor. "Sarah was my sister," Victoria said. "She wrote to me every week, every single week, wherever she was, however hard things were. Her last letter, written 3 days before she died, said this." Victoria reached into the pocket of her riding habit and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She held it out. Eliza took it. The paper was yellowed and soft from handling, the edges worn. The handwriting was slanted and shaky, written by a hand that was tired or in pain. The letter was short. It read, "Dearest Victoria, if anything happens to me, please look after May. Caleb is strong and he loves her more than anything. But he does not know how to live alone. He will need help even if he is too proud to ask for it. Promise me you will be there for May. She is all that matters. Your loving sister, Sarah." Eliza read it twice. Then she folded it and handed it back. "I am doing what my sister asked me to do," Victoria said. Her voice was unsteady now. "You can say I am wrong. You can say my methods are extreme, but do not you dare say I do not love that girl." Eliza looked at this woman, this supposed villain, this wealthy aunt who had hired bounty hunters and bribed judges and turned a custody dispute into a war, and she saw something she had not expected to see. Pain. Victoria Ashford was not a monster. She was a grieving sister who had been given a deathbed charge and had pursued it with every tool available to her, including the wrong ones. She was wrong about the method. She was not wrong about the love. "You love May in your way," Eliza said slowly, "but your way is scaring that child half to death. She has nightmares about men on horses coming to take her away. She flinches when someone knocks on the door. That is not what Sarah wanted." Victoria's jaw tightened. She folded the letter with trembling hands and put it back in her pocket. "I will see you in court," she said. She mounted her horse and rode away without looking back. But Eliza noticed that her hands were shaking on the reins. That evening, Eliza brought Caleb a bowl of stew. He was sitting in the parlor alone, staring at the cold fireplace. He looked up when she came in, and something in his eyes shifted. Surprise, a fragile, guarded hope. Eliza set the bowl on the table beside him. She did not speak. She did not sit down. She turned and walked out. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close. But it was the first sign that she had not given up on him entirely. And Caleb, who knew something about reading small signals after years of working with horses that would bolt at a shadow, understood what it meant, He ate the stew slowly, tasting nothing, feeling everything. That night, Eliza found Dutch on the front porch. The old foreman was sitting in a rocking chair with a shotgun across his knees, watching the road. His face was the color of ashes. "What is it?" Eliza asked. Dutch handed her a scrap of paper. It had been nailed to the ranch gate sometime during the day. The handwriting was rough and blunt. "Hearing is Friday. If Hart does not hand over the girl, I'm coming to collect. This time, I will not knock." Below the words, someone had drawn a bullet. Caleb Hart had lost his wife, nearly lost his daughter, and was about to lose his freedom. But the thing keeping him awake tonight was not the hearing. It was the way Eliza looked at him, like a grave she had already dug but had not bothered filling in. The hearing was 2 days away. Caleb sat at his desk in the study going through papers by lamplight. Ranch accounts, cattle contracts, deed records. Everything he had built, everything his father had built before him. All of it could be taken away by a man in a black robe sitting in a courtroom 15 miles south. There was a knock at the study door. It was not Martha's knock, which was brisk and efficient. It was not Dutch's, which was heavy as a hammer. This knock was measured. Careful. "Come in," Caleb said. Eliza opened the door. She stood in the doorway in the clean dress Martha had given her, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he had met her. She looked different without the braid. Younger, softer, less like a woman built for survival, and more like the woman she might have been if the world had not taken everything from her. She also looked like she had made a decision, and Caleb braced himself because her decisions so far had all involved telling him hard truths he did not want to hear. "Victoria came to see me today," Eliza said. Caleb's hand stilled on the papers. "What did she say?" Eliza came in and sat in the chair across from his desk. She told him about the visit, about the letter from Sarah, about the trembling hands and the genuine grief and the hard, bright pain in Victoria's eyes. "She showed me the letter," Eliza said. "Sarah asked Victoria to look after May." Caleb was quiet for a long time. His face went through several things that Eliza could not name, and then it settled into something blank and wounded. "Sarah wrote that," he said. "It was not a question." "I believe it is real," Eliza said. "But a letter does not mean Victoria should raise May. It only means she is not pure evil. And if we treat her like a monster in that courtroom, the judge will not side with us." The door opened, and Emmett Carson walked in. He was Caleb's lawyer, a thin man of 55 with gray hair cropped short, and the sharp, assessing eyes of a man who had spent 20 years in courtrooms, and before that had spent 4 years commanding a company of Union infantry. He did not believe in small talk, sentiment, or lost causes. He did, however, believe in preparation. "We have a problem," Carson said without preamble. He sat down and laid a leather folio on the desk. "Actually, we have several problems, but one of them is bigger than the others." He opened the folio and spread papers across the desk. "Caleb, you violated a court order. That is a fact. If Penfield brings it up first, and he will, we lose. Not might lose. Will lose." There was silence. "What do we do?" Caleb asked. "We prove the original custody order was unlawful," Carson said, "that it was signed by a judge who was paid off by Raymond Ashford. If we can prove that, the order is void and your violation becomes a technicality." "Can we prove it?" Eliza asked. Both men looked at her. Carson with surprise. Caleb with something more complicated. Carson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe. I have heard things. Ashford has been spending money in places that do not show up in the bank records. But hearing things and proving things in court are two different animals. There is something else," Eliza said. Both men waited. "Victoria does not know what her husband is doing." Eliza met Carson's eyes. "She thinks this is about May. But I am not sure Raymond Ashford cares about May at all. I think he's using Victoria, using her grief to get something else." Carson leaned forward. "What makes you say that?" "Because Victoria came here alone. No lawyers, no hired men, no one from her husband's operation. She came to talk about her sister and her niece. That is not how a woman behaves when she's part of a scheme. That is how a woman behaves when she is the last one to know." Carson looked at Caleb. "She might be right." "What would Ashford want?" Caleb asked. "If not May?" Carson pulled another document from his folio. "I have been doing some digging. Raymond Ashford has been buying land through a company called Western Consolidated Holdings, small parcels scattered around." He unfolded a map and laid it on the desk. "But when you put them together, they form a ring around Hart Ranch." Caleb stared at the map. "He is trying to box me in." "He is trying to take your ranch," Carson said flatly. "If you lose custody of May, Victoria gets the girl and Ashford uses the family disruption as leverage. He calls in your loans from his bank. He blocks your cattle drives through land he now controls. He squeezes until you sell or go under, and then he buys the ranch for pennies on the dollar." The room was very quiet. "We need proof," Carson said. "Bank records, transaction ledgers, something that connects Ashford directly to the land purchases." There was a knock at the study door. Dutch came in without waiting. "I heard," the old man said. He looked at the map, at the documents, at the faces around the desk. "You need someone to get inside that bank." "Dutch?" Caleb started. "I know that bank," Dutch said. He spoke quietly, the way a man speaks when his mind is already made up. "I installed the locks on the back door 5 years ago when Ashford renovated. Hired me because I was the best locksmith in the territory before I was the best foreman." He paused. "I can get in." "It is illegal," Carson said. "So is buying a judge," Dutch replied. Carson looked at Caleb, looked at Dutch, looked at Eliza. "If we get caught," he said, "Caleb goes to prison and loses everything. If we do not try," Dutch said, "he loses everything anyway." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Caleb nodded. "Tomorrow night," he said. "The hearing is the day after. We get the records, we bring them to court, we end this." Dutch nodded. He looked at Eliza. "You keep an eye on the little miss while we handle this." He paused, and something in his expression softened. "You are the only one she trusts outside of Martha and the boss." Eliza met his eyes. "I will keep her safe." Dutch smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who has been in enough fights to know that not everyone walks away. But it was real. "I believe you will," he said. After Carson and Dutch left, Caleb and Eliza were alone in the study. The lamp burned low. Shadows moved on the walls. "You did not have to do any of this," Caleb said. Eliza stood by the window. Outside, the valley was dark. Stars burned cold above the mountains. "No," she said, "I did not. So why are you still here?" She was quiet for a long time. "Because that little girl asked me to promise I would not leave, and I do not break promises, not even to people I am angry with." Caleb stood up from the desk. He crossed the room to where she stood and stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak low, far enough to give her room. "I should have told you the truth from the start," he said. "Yes, you should have. I was afraid. I know. Not afraid you would leave. Afraid you would look at me the way you are looking at me right now, like I am a man who does not deserve trust." Eliza turned toward him. The lamplight caught the angles of her face, the curve of her jaw, the dark steadiness of her eyes. "You are the man who crawled through the desert so your daughter could drink the last of the water," she said. "You are also the man who lied to the woman who saved your life. Both of those things are true at the same time. I am still learning how to live with both." "Can you?" Caleb asked. Eliza looked at him for a long beat. Then she said, "I do not know yet." He extended his hand, not to touch her. He rested it on the windowsill beside hers, his little finger an inch from hers. She did not pull away. They stood like that for a minute, two people looking out at the same darkness, separated by the space between their hands and everything it contained. Then Eliza stepped back. "I am going to check on May," she said, "and you need to sleep. Whatever comes tomorrow, it will not go well if you are falling over." She walked to the door, paused. "Caleb." "Yes. For what it is worth, I think you are a good father. A damn fool in several other departments, but a good father." She left. Caleb stood at the window for a long time after she was gone. Then he sat down at his desk and put his head in his hands. Three things happened simultaneously on the night before the hearing. Dutch broke into the bank, Wilder broke into the ranch, and Eliza discovered she was willing to kill a man. Dutch and Tom Brennan, the ranch foreman, rode into Ridgewood after dark. The town was quiet, most of its 500 residents in bed or in one of the two saloons at the far end of Main Street. The Ashford Bank sat on the corner of Main and 2nd, a brick building with iron bars on the windows and a heavy oak door that was triple locked every evening by the bank manager. Dutch had installed those locks. He dismounted in the alley behind the bank and handed his reins to Tom. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. "If I'm not out, ride back to the ranch." Tom, who was 35 and had been foreman at Hart Ranch for 3 years and owed his life to Dutch from an incident involving a stampede and a flooded river crossing, said nothing. He just held the reins and waited. Dutch worked the back door lock with a set of picks he had not used in years, but whose feel he had never forgotten. The lock opened in 3 minutes. He slipped inside. The bank smelled of ink, paper, and old wood. Dutch moved through the teller area past the counting room to the office at the back where Raymond Ashford kept his private safe. The safe was newer, a heavy iron box with a combination lock that Dutch had not installed. He spent 4 minutes on it, listening to the tumblers click, his old fingers still and steady despite the sweat running down his forehead. The safe opened. Inside, Dutch found the land transaction ledger, a thick leather-bound book filled with columns of figures and property descriptions. He also found a stack of correspondence, and one letter in particular caught his eye. It was written in a woman's hand addressed to Raymond. It read, "Leave the ranch alone. I only want May. I do not care about the land. Do not make this about money, Raymond. It is about my sister's child." It was signed Victoria. Dutch put the ledger and the letter inside his coat. He closed the safe, relocked the door, and slipped back into the alley. Tom was waiting. They mounted up and rode for the edge of town. They had gone 2 blocks when a voice called out from the darkness. "Who is there?" A man stepped out of the doorway of the general store, buttoning his coat. The night watchman. He held a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Dutch and Tom kicked their horses into a gallop. The watchman fired. The shot cracked through the still night air, and Tom grunted and slumped in his saddle. The bullet had taken him in the shoulder. Dutch grabbed Tom's reins with one hand and drove both horses hard down the alley and out of town. Behind them he heard shouting, a bell ringing, the sound of pursuit organizing. They rode into the darkness. Dutch held the ledger tight against his ribs and rode like hell. At the ranch, the night had started quiet. Caleb was in the barn checking on a mare that was due to foal. Most of the hands were in the bunkhouse. Martha was upstairs with May. Eliza was on the porch with her rifle across her knees, watching the road the way she had been watching everything for the past week, with the patient, unblinking focus of someone who expects the worst and intends to be ready for it. She smelled the smoke before she saw the light. It came from the east side of the property, near the horse barn, a faint orange glow that grew quickly, fed by dry hay and old timber. Within seconds, flames were licking at the barn roof and the horses inside began to scream. "Fire!" Eliza shouted. She stood and ran to the porch rail. "Fire in the horse barn!" Men poured out of the bunkhouse. Caleb burst from the main barn and ran toward the blaze. Hands grabbed buckets, formed a line to the water trough. The night exploded into chaos, shouts and running feet and the terrible sound of horses screaming. In the confusion, Eliza saw something that no one else saw. A shadow moved across the yard from the direction of the burning barn toward the main house. It was quick, low, and purposeful. Not the motion of a man running to help, the motion of a man using the fire as cover. Eliza gripped the rifle and went inside. The house was dark. Martha and May were upstairs. Eliza moved through the parlor toward the staircase, her boots quiet on the wooden floor. She stopped at the foot of the stairs and listened. Silence. Then, above her, the slow, careful creak of a floorboard. Someone was already inside. Eliza went up the stairs. She moved the way Thomas had taught her to move in the woods, heel to toe, weight balanced, rifle up. The hallway at the top was dark except for a thin line of lamplight under May's door. A figure stood in the hallway, between Eliza and the door to May's room. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful confidence of a man who was used to being in dark places. He turned and the lamplight from under the door caught his face. The scar across the left eye, the flat, calculating gaze. Silas Wilder. He saw Eliza at the same moment she saw him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. "Step aside, Mrs. Crow," Wilder said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I do not want to hurt you. I am just here for the girl." "You take one more step," Eliza said. "I pull this trigger." Wilder looked at her, looked at the rifle, looked at the door behind him where May slept. He took a step. Eliza fired. The shot was deafening in the narrow hallway. The bullet hit Wilder in the thigh. He stumbled, cursing, and his hand went to his holster. He drew his revolver and fired back. The bullet passed so close to Eliza's ear that she felt the heat of it. It buried itself in the wall behind her, splintering wood and plaster. If she had been standing 1 inch to the right, it would have taken her through the skull. Behind them, May's door flew open. Martha stood in the doorway, her gray hair wild, a shotgun in her hands. Wilder looked at the shotgun, looked at Eliza, who was already working the rifle lever to chamber another round, looked at Martha, whose finger was on the trigger and whose face said she would pull it. He holstered his revolver. He dragged himself to the staircase, blood streaming from his thigh, and half fell, half crawled down the steps and out the front door, disappearing into the chaos of the fire. Eliza lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The hallway smelled of gunpowder and blood. May appeared behind Martha. The child's face was white, her eyes enormous. Eliza crossed the hallway and knelt in front of her. She gathered the girl into her arms with one hand, the rifle still warm in the other. "You are safe," she said. Her voice was steady. "I have got you." May buried her face in Eliza's neck and cried. Downstairs, the front door banged open and Caleb came in at a run. His face was black with soot, his shirt scorched. He took the stairs 3 at a time and found them in the hallway. Eliza on the floor holding May, Martha standing guard, a bullet hole in the wall 6 inches from where Eliza's head had been. Caleb dropped to his knees in front of Eliza. He did not speak. He pressed his forehead against her knees in the gesture of a man who has come apart at the seams and does not know how to put himself back together. Eliza rested her hand on his head. Her fingers touched his hair, felt the grit and ash. She held it there for a moment, feeling his shoulders shaking, feeling the weight of everything he carried. Then she withdrew her hand and said, "May is all right. She is all right." Caleb lifted his head. His eyes were wet and his face was ruined with smoke and fear. He looked at the bullet hole in the wall, then at Eliza. "He almost took you from me," Caleb said. The words came out raw and broken, and Eliza heard something in them that she was not ready to hear. So she said nothing. She held May and waited for the shaking to stop. The horse barn burned to the ground. 3 horses died. 2 ranch hands suffered burns. The rest of Wilder's men scattered into the dark when the hands organized and started shooting back. An hour later, Dutch and Tom rode in. Tom was slumped in his saddle, his shoulder wrapped in a bloody bandana. Dutch looked like he had aged 10 years in one night, but he held the ledger up when he saw Caleb, and something fierce and old burned in his eyes. "Got it, boss," Dutch said. "Got everything." Carson arrived at dawn. He spread the ledger on Caleb's desk and went through it page by page. His face grew harder with each entry. Raymond Ashford had purchased 8 parcels of land surrounding Hart Ranch through a shell company called Western Consolidated Holdings. The transactions were spread over 2 years, timed to coincide with each stage of the custody dispute. Every time Victoria filed a new motion, Ashford quietly bought another piece of land. Dutch reached into his coat and produced the letter. "Found this in the safe, too," he said, "from Victoria to her husband." Carson read it. His eyebrows rose. "She did not know," he said. "No," Eliza said from the doorway. "She did not." Carson looked up at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at the evidence spread across the desk. "Caleb," he said, "we are not just going to keep May. We are going to bury Raymond Ashford." He paused. "But I need Mrs. Crow on that witness stand. I need her to tell the judge she is staying. Staying for real." Eliza looked at Caleb. He stood on the far side of the desk, his face streaked with soot, his eyes bloodshot. He said nothing, did not plead, did not push, just stood there, waiting. She nodded. Once. Enough. The Ridgewood Courthouse held 40 seats. Today, 80 people packed the room. Half of them had come to watch Caleb Hart fall. The other half came because they understood that out here on the frontier, justice was not something you received. It was something you took. Eliza sat on the right side of the courtroom in the best dress Martha had been able to find. A dark blue cotton with white buttons and a lace collar that had probably belonged to Sarah Hart. It fit well enough, and Martha had altered the waist the night before. Eliza's hair was braided and pinned. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked respectable, which was the point. Beside her, Caleb wore a dark suit, clean-shaven, his hair combed. He looked every inch the successful rancher. But Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders, the white of his knuckles where his hands gripped the edge of the bench. May sat between them in a white dress, her blonde hair brushed until it shone. She held Caleb's hand on one side and Eliza's on the other. Across the aisle, Victoria Ashford sat in the front row. She was dressed in black, her back rigid, her face drawn. She looked like a woman who had been struck and was still trying to understand by whom. Carson had sent her the letter from the safe the night before, along with a summary of her husband's land dealings. Victoria had not responded. Raymond Ashford sat beside her. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a banker's soft hands and a politician's smooth face. He looked calm, confident, the confidence of a man who has paid good money for a particular outcome and sees no reason why it should not be delivered. Judge Walter Harmon entered through the side door, and the room fell silent. He was 60, gray-haired, stern as a headstone, wearing black robes that made him look like a preacher at a hanging. He took his seat behind the bench and surveyed the courtroom through steel-rimmed spectacles. "Court is in session," the bailiff announced. "The matter of Victoria Ashford versus Caleb Hart. Petition for custody of the minor child, May Elizabeth Hart." Harmon nodded. Mr. Penfield, present your case. Marcus Penfield was Victoria's lawyer. He was slim, polished, expensively dressed, and he moved through the courtroom with the easy confidence of a man who knew every judge in the territory by first name. He buttoned his jacket and stood. Your Honor, this case is tragically simple. A father, still grieving the loss of his wife, made a series of decisions that put his young daughter's life at grave risk. 3 weeks ago, he removed the child from the territory in direct violation of a lawful custody order. He took her into dangerous country without adequate supplies or protection. A heat storm struck. He lost their horses. The child suffered heat stroke and severe dehydration. She nearly died. Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Furthermore, Penfield continued, upon returning to his ranch, Mr. Hart left the child in the care of a stranger, a woman with no credentials, no references, no legal standing. The ranch has become an armed camp. The horse barn burned down 2 nights ago under suspicious circumstances. 2 workers were injured. This is no environment for a young girl. He paused for effect. My client, Mrs. Ashford, offers stability, a proper home, education, female guidance, the resources to ensure May's safety and future. She is asking this court to do what any reasonable person would do. Put the child's welfare first. He sat down. Judge Harmon turned his gaze to the other side. Mr. Carson. Emmett Carson stood. He was not polished like Penfield. He was lean, weathered, dressed in a suit that had seen better days. But when he spoke, his voice filled the courtroom, the way a campfire fills a clearing, steady and warm and impossible to ignore. Your Honor, Mr. Penfield has given you a story. It is not the whole story. Let me provide the rest. He laid out the facts. Caleb had taken May to visit her mother's grave, a trip they had made before. An unpredictable heat storm struck. The horses bolted. Caleb gave his daughter every drop of water he carried and then crawled through the desert on his hands and knees trying to save her. That was not negligence. That was love. As for the woman caring for May, Carson continued, Mrs. Eliza Crow is not a stranger. She is the person who saved both their lives, at the cost of her own water, her own safety, and ultimately her own home, which was burned to the ground by men in the employ of the petitioner's husband. Penfield objected. Carson pressed on. The security measures at the ranch are not evidence of instability. They are a necessary response to repeated threats and harassment. Armed men have come to the property 3 times. 2 nights ago, they set fire to a barn, and one of them broke into the house and attempted to forcibly remove the child at gunpoint. Mrs. Crow stopped him. With a rifle. The courtroom stirred. Mr. Hart is a successful rancher, a respected member of this community, and a devoted father. His only crime is being a widower who was backed into a corner by people with more money than conscience. That should not be grounds for destroying a family. He sat down. Harmon looked at both sides. I will hear from the witnesses. What followed was 2 hours of testimony. Victoria's side brought society women who said ranches were no place for girls. A doctor who described the dangers of heat stroke. A banker who questioned Caleb's financial management. Carson cross-examined each one. Poked holes, revealed connections to the Ashfords, exposed the lack of first-hand knowledge about May's actual welfare. Then it was Carson's turn. I call Mrs. Eliza Crow. Eliza stood. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were steady. She walked to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She sat down and looked out at the courtroom. Victoria's cold stare, Raymond's calculating eyes, Caleb's face drawn tight with desperate hope. And May, small and solemn between Martha and Dutch, watching Eliza the way she watched everything, with those dark, serious eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Crow, Carson said, please tell the court how you met Mr. Hart and his daughter. Eliza took a breath. She told them. She told them about the drought, the cabin, the sound of a child crying in the desert. She told them about finding May collapsed and dying, about Caleb crawling toward his daughter with nothing left in him but the will to reach her. She told them about the days in her cabin, how Caleb never left May's side, how he gave up food and water for her, how his every thought was for the child's welfare. She told them about the journey, the gunfight on the trail, the fire. Wilder in the hallway with his hand on his gun, 10 steps from a sleeping child. And then she told them the part that Carson had asked her to tell, and Caleb had begged her not to. He did not tell me the whole truth, Eliza said. Her voice was steady and clear, and it carried to every corner of the room. He did not tell me about the court order. He did not tell me he was running. I was angry when I found out. I am still angry. She paused. But I also understand why. He was a father backed into a corner, facing people with more power and more money than he could fight. He made the wrong choice about how to protect his daughter, but he made the right choice about why. He chose May. Every single time, in every single moment, he chose May. That is not negligence. That is a father who would die for his child. I know, because I watched him almost do it. Penfield stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Crow, you are a destitute widow. No home, no means. You are living under Mr. Hart's roof, eating from his table. You have every financial motive to defend him. Mr. Hart offered me money, Eliza said. I refused. He offered me land. I refused. He offered to marry me so I would have legal standing. I refused that too. The courtroom buzzed. I stayed, Eliza said, because a 5-year-old girl held on to me in the dark and said, "You are like Mama." She looked directly at Penfield. How much money buys that? Penfield had no answer. Carson called his next witness. He introduced the land transaction ledger. Page by page, entry by entry, he laid out the evidence that Raymond Ashford had used the custody dispute as cover for a systematic campaign to acquire Hart Ranch. Raymond surged to his feet. This is outrageous. These records were obtained illegally. Judge Harmon looked at him over his spectacles. Sit down, Mr. Ashford. I will determine what is admissible in my courtroom. Raymond sat. His face was the color of raw liver. Then Victoria stood. The entire courtroom turned to look at her. Penfield reached for her arm. She shook him off. Your Honor, Victoria said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I wish to withdraw my petition. Raymond grabbed her wrist. Victoria, sit down. She pulled free and looked at her husband with an expression that would have wilted steel. No, she said. My sister asked me to protect May. She did not ask me to help you steal a man's ranch. She turned to Caleb, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was no hatred in her face. Only grief and regret and the terrible clarity of a woman who has just understood how completely she has been used. I am sorry, Victoria said to Caleb, not for wanting May, for the way I went about it. The courtroom was silent. Then Carson said, Your Honor, I would like to call one more witness. May Hart. May walked to the stand. She was so small she needed a cushion on the chair to see over the railing. Her white dress made her look even younger than her 5 years, but her eyes were steady. May, the judge said. His voice gentled. Do you know why you are here? Yes, sir. Because Aunt Victoria wants me to live with her. And how do you feel about that? May's voice was small but clear. I want to stay with Papa, and I want Miss Eliza to stay too. But I also want to see Aunt Victoria sometimes, because she is Mama's sister, and Mama would have wanted that. The courtroom did not move, did not breathe. Judge Harmon sat back in his chair. He looked at Victoria, at Caleb, at Eliza, at May. I have heard enough, he said. Mrs. Ashford, your petition is denied. May Hart will remain in her father's custody, full and permanent. Victoria nodded. She did not argue. Furthermore, Judge Harmon continued, I am referring the matter of the land transactions to the territorial prosecutor for investigation. Mr. Ashford, I would advise you to retain counsel. He looked at Caleb. As for the custody order violation, given the circumstances and the evidence that the original order was obtained through improper influence, I am dismissing the matter. He paused. However, Mrs. Ashford has demonstrated genuine concern for the child, however misguided her methods. I am granting supervised visitation rights to be arranged between the parties in good faith. He looked at May. "Young lady, you are going home with your father." He brought down the gavel. The courtroom erupted. Ranch hands surged forward, clapping Caleb on the back. Martha gathered May into her arms. Carson shook hands and collected his papers. Victoria sat alone on her side of the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, tears running silently down her face. Eliza watched Raymond Ashford being escorted from the room by two men who looked like territorial marshals. Real ones this time. His face was gray and his hands were shaking. Then she looked for Dutch. She found him outside, sitting on the courthouse steps. His face was the color of old ash, and his breathing was wrong, shallow and rapid and wet-sounding. His left hand was pressed against his ribs, and when he moved it, Eliza saw the blood. "Dutch," she said. The old man looked up at her and smiled. His teeth were red. "We won, little miss," he said. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed sideways on the steps. Dutch Miller died on a Tuesday morning just as the sun touched the ridge tops and the cattle were filing down to drink at the creek. He died the way he had lived, quietly, stubbornly, and while protecting someone else. The doctor said it was blood poisoning. The bullet graze Dutch took during the bank job had been deeper than he let on, and he had ridden through the night without treating it. By the time they got him to a bed, the infection had spread. Gangrene set in. There was nothing to be done. Before he died, Dutch gripped Caleb's hand. "Boss," he said. His voice was a whisper like wind through dry grass. "Do not be a fool. Marry that woman. Marry her proper. Not because of any courtroom, because she stood in a dark hallway with a rifle so your little girl could sleep." Caleb could not speak. He held the old man's hand and nodded. Dutch's eyes moved to Eliza, who stood at the foot of the bed. "You remind me of my wife," Dutch said. "She could shoot straight, too." He grinned. It was the last thing he did. They buried him on the hill behind the ranch house in a spot that overlooked the valley. 40 hands stood bareheaded in the sun, while the circuit preacher read from the book of Psalms. May stood between Caleb and Eliza, holding both their hands. Martha wept silently. Eliza placed a wildflower on the grave. It was the kind that grew beside her old cabin, a tough little purple bloom that survived drought and frost, and everything else the frontier could throw at it. She did not know how it had found its way into her pocket. She did not question it. After the funeral, the ranch hands drifted back to their work. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending. The work did not stop for grief. It never did. Caleb stood at Dutch's grave long after everyone else had gone. Eliza found him there at sunset. He did not look up when she approached. 30 years, Caleb said. He worked for my father before he worked for me. He taught me to ride, taught me to shoot, taught me that a man's word is the only currency that never depreciates. He was a good man, Eliza said, the best I ever knew. They stood together as the sun went down and the stars came out one by one. Then Eliza said something that she had been carrying for days, something that had been growing heavier with each passing hour. "I am leaving," she said. Caleb turned to look at her. "Dutch died because I nodded my head when Carson asked if I would stay," Eliza said. "If I had not been here, if none of this had happened." "Dutch died because he chose," Caleb said. His voice was rough but steady. "Same as you chose to save May. Same as I chose to crawl across that desert. Nobody here was forced." Eliza's jaw tightened. She looked out at the valley, at the river catching the last light, at the mountains standing dark against the sky. "I am afraid," she said. "Of what?" "Of loving." The word came out cracked and raw, like something that had been locked away too long. "Every time I love someone, they die. Thomas, Jamie, now Dutch." She turned to face him and her eyes were bright and terrible. "If I stay, if I let myself, and then I lose you, or May, I will not survive it again." Caleb was quiet for a long time. He did not reach for her. He did not make promises he could not keep. He did not say, "I will not die," because they both knew that out here on the frontier, death was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The only question was when. "I cannot promise you forever," he said, "but I can promise you today. And tomorrow I will promise again. And the day after that. For as long as I am breathing." Eliza looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, carefully, measuring, weighing the cost against the gain. She had been doing that calculation for 3 years, ever since she dug 2 graves behind a cabin in a high valley, and decided that surviving was the most she could ask of herself. But surviving was not living. She knew that now. She had known it since the moment she walked out into the sun and found a child crying in the dirt, and chose to save her instead of walking away. She set down the bag she had packed. "If you make me regret this," she said, "I will shoot you." "I know," Caleb said. She looked at him, this man who had crawled through the desert and lied to her face and fought for his daughter, and stood at his foreman's grave with tears on his cheeks, this man who had never once asked her to stay, who had only ever said, "The choice is yours." She stepped toward him. The first kiss was not dramatic. It was not the kind of kiss that belongs in a dime novel, all fire and thunder and swelling music. It was quiet, careful. The kiss of 2 people who have lost everything and are terrified of losing again, but who have decided that the terror is worth it, that the risk of loving is better than the certainty of being alone. They stood on the hill beside Dutch's grave with the stars burning overhead and the ranch spread out below them. And they held each other in the way that only people who have been broken and rebuilt can hold. Not desperately, not hungrily, gently, like something that might break if you squeeze too hard. After a while, Eliza pulled back and looked at him. "I am not going to be some rancher's quiet wife," she said. "I have opinions and I know numbers and I do not take orders well." "I know," Caleb said. "I have seen the way you negotiate cattle prices. I am frankly terrified." "Good." They walked down the hill together, hand in hand, toward the lighted windows of the house where May was waiting. 3 months later, they married in the small church in Ridgewood. Just family. Martha stood up for Eliza. Tom Brennan, his arm still in a sling, stood up for Caleb. May carried a handful of wildflowers and wore a blue dress that Eliza had sewn herself. Eliza did not wear white. She wore a dress the color of a Montana sky in autumn, deep blue with pearl buttons, and when the circuit preacher asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," in a voice that carried to the back of the church and meant every syllable. Caleb spoke his vows and his voice cracked on the last line. "I did not save you," he said. "You saved me. And I want to spend whatever years I have got left being worthy of that." Tom Brennan stepped into Dutch's boots as foreman. He did not try to fill them. Nobody could. But he was steady and capable, and the ranch kept running. Eliza took over the books. Within 6 months, she had renegotiated 3 cattle contracts, secured a timber deal that brought in twice what Caleb had been getting, and convinced the feed supplier that he had been overcharging by 12%. The ranch hands started calling her the boss's boss, and they meant it as the highest compliment they knew. Raymond Ashford was tried, convicted of land fraud, and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial penitentiary at Deer Lodge. Victoria divorced him before the trial was over. She sold the house in Ridgewood and moved to Helena, where she opened a small bookshop and lived quietly. She sent May a gift at Christmas, a porcelain doll and a letter that said 2 words. "I am sorry." May wrote back. The letter said, "I love you, Aunt Victoria. Mama would be glad we are friends." Caleb did not interfere. One evening in early spring, almost a year after it all began, Eliza climbed the hill behind the ranch house. 3 headstones stood in a row, looking out over the valley. Thomas Crow, Jamie Crow, Dutch Miller. She stood in front of Thomas's stone and spoke to him the way she used to, back in the cabin, back when his grave was the only company she had. "I found a home, Thomas," she said. "Not like ours. Different, bigger, louder." full of people who track mud on the floors and argue about fence lines and eat more biscuits than any reasonable human beings should? She paused. I love him. Not the way I loved you. Different, but real. And I think you would understand. I think you would want me to stop surviving and start living. I think you would want me to be happy. She touched the stone. I will always love you, she said. Both of you. Forever. She stood there a while longer, listening to the evening wind move through the grass. Then she turned and walked down the hill toward the house, where the windows were yellow with lamplight, and she could hear May's laughter drifting out through the open door. Caleb was on the porch waiting for her. He held 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. Their fingers touched. They stood side by side and watched the sun set behind the mountains, the sky turning gold and crimson, and then slowly, softly, the deep blue of a Montana night. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. I cannot promise you forever, he said. Same words he had said on the hill beside Dutch's grave. But I can promise you today, she finished. He kissed the top of her head. Behind them, the door opened and May came running out. Mama Eliza, Papa, come inside. Martha made pie, and she says if you do not come now, she is giving your pieces to the hands. They laughed, both of them. The kind of laugh that only comes when you have cried enough to earn it. They went inside. Together. 15 years later, May Hart stood on that same porch on a morning in early summer. She was 20 years old, tall like her father, with her mother's fair hair and Eliza's steady gaze. The ranch spread out before her, bigger now than it had been. There was a schoolhouse that Mama Eliza had built for the workers' children. There was a shelter for women in hard circumstances, the kind of women Eliza had once been, alone and desperate and needing someone to hand them a cup of water and say, "You are welcome here." Papa was at the corrals, his hair silver at the temples, still in the saddle every morning. Mama Eliza sat at the big desk in the study doing the books, running the numbers, making the deals. Nobody in Montana tried to lowball the Hart Ranch anymore. They knew better. On the hill behind the house, 4 headstones stood in a row. Thomas, Jamie, Dutch, and Martha, who had died the previous spring, quietly, in her sleep, the way she would have wanted. May opened her journal. She had been writing the story down because she was afraid that if nobody did, the world would forget. And some things were too important to forget. She wrote the first line. In the summer of 1887, the drought killed everything in the high valleys of Montana. But in that killing heat, a poor widow heard a child crying in the dust, and instead of turning away, she walked out into the sun. May looked up from the page. Below, Mama Eliza crossed the yard carrying 2 cups of coffee. She climbed the porch steps and handed one to Papa, who had come up from the corrals. Their fingers touched. They stood together watching the sunrise, the way they had done every morning for 15 years, without ever missing a single day. May smiled and bent back to her journal. She had a story to tell. And it started with water. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.